welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Hanna Griesbeck. I'm the project manager of the Industry One, and I will be your host and moderator for today. So, a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today and what you can expect from the next hour. So I'll give a quick introduction of the Industry One for those who don't already know what it is. Then we'll go into revealing the industry dashboard scores of 2025, which then will lead us into a moderated panel discussion with our lovely speakers, and followed by some closing remarks. So let's get started. The Industry One was initiated by the Ethical Trading Initiative, Fairware, and Cascale. We were born out of both frustration and hope. Frustration at the lack of meaningful progress and hope in the industry's transformative potential. Our vision is clear: an industry that ensures dignity for workers, thriving businesses that give more than they take, and a planet safeguarded for future generations. With this purpose in mind, the industry that we want developed a set of industry-wide metrics to measure progress or the lack thereof on an annual basis and leverage action on living wages, greenhouse gas emission, and purchasing practices. We don't do this by ourselves at all. The metrics are created in collaboration with a number of partners, namely the 3 lead organizations, which are ETI, Fairware, and Cascale, as well as our data partners, Better Buying, the WageIndicator, Worldly, Apparel Impact Institute, Cascale, and Textile Exchange, as well as the Industry One team, which are in the background here, Sophie Ferretti and Omari Palmer, as well as our graphic designer, Annemiek. But yes, real quick into the dashboard. So an overview of it. Basically what we do is we synthesize extensive wage data and feedback from more than 1,300 suppliers across major production countries, as well as new estimates of our sector's supply chain emissions. Since the inception of the Industry One, the metrics have been updated on an annual basis, so we can gauge how the industry is progressing. This year's scores shows a varied progress in the garment industry, with improved scores in some areas while others are moving in the wrong direction. But before we dive into this year's metrics, because what you can see right now are the past years, I would like to, with a lot of admiration for the work that our partners do, I would like to announce that this will be the last iteration of the Industry One dashboard, and with it, the metrics as well. The data still continues to exist with the, but just not with the Industry One, as we won't publish the dashboard anymore. But please do keep seeking out the amazing work that Better Buying, WageIndicator, Apparel Impact Institute, Worldly, Cascale, and the Textile Exchange do. So with that being said, let's dive into what the actual metrics are. We'll be starting off with the purchasing practice metric. So this metric is based on data from the Better Buying Partnership Index survey, which is an annual 12-point survey where suppliers rate their buyers' purchasing practices on a scale from 1 to 5, classifying them as true partners, collaborators, or detractors. This year's score is the highest it has ever been, reflecting strong supplier-buyer relationship and continuous improvements across 10 key areas. The most significant gains were in supply chain collaboration on innovations, business stability, and preferred partnerships. The fact that true partner buyers now make up 65% of the ratings, compared to 63% in 2024, is a move in the right directions towards stronger partnerships. Buyers are increasingly seeking supplier input on product and progress improvement, signaling a move towards greater collaboration as well. Then again, adding to that, buyer-supplier visibility and stability have steadily improved over 2 years, and fair financial practices saw a 3.6% increase, in which supports supplier financial health and efficiency. However, buyers' operational efficiency was the only practice in the BBPI rating cycle to decline. While these improvements are encouraging, they remain incremental. The survey reflects positive trends, but does not capture the full reality of the industry. The improvements we can see are asset, which underlines that the industry's deep-rooted power imbalances persists. Many suppliers still operate under significant pressure, with little leverage to negotiate better terms. Then our second metric is the wage metric. This metric illustrates the gap between legal minimum wages and living wages in major garment sector manufacturing countries, providing a comprehensive overview of wage data. All the countries benchmarked available are averaged, and the lowest and highest are shown. To make sure we're all on the same page, we see living wages is the minimum income necessary for a worker and their family to meet basic needs, including some discretionary income. The wage gap has narrowed, as we can see, slightly, showing a decrease from 49.5% in 2024 to 41% this year. This reflects a narrowing of the wage gap overall by 8.5%, meaning that the average percentage gap between minimum wages and the average living wage has reduced. Diving a bit deeper, we can see that South Korea and Turkey have completely eliminated their wage gap after recent minimum wage hikes. In contrast, though, on the other side of the spectrum, the gap grew in Pakistan from 46 to 51% as wages lagged behind rising living costs. And again, a further bit down the side it should be on the right side of your screen, you can see that India now has the widest gap at 69% due to persistent low textile sector wages, overtaking China, which improved its score by 10% and now has slightly smaller gap than Vietnam and Tunisia. Again, this clearly illustrates that despite the overall improvement, the gap between minimum wages and living wages is still far too wide and remains a challenge across key garment-producing countries, leaving millions of garment workers earning below a living wage, unable to cover basic needs despite driving a highly profitable industry. And our final score, the greenhouse gas metric. This score is calculated using the most widely representative data available, fiber volume data from Textile Exchange, complemented by the greenhouse gas impact data from Cascale's Higg Material Sustainability Index and Worldly. Since industry data is collected and analyzed annually, the data presented in this year's 2025 greenhouse gas metric is based on fiber volume data from 2023. So even though it's the 2025 metric, the data is from the year 2023. So this year's metric does show a very, very worrying trend. Emissions have increased by 7% compared to the previous year and are the highest since we started measuring in 2019. The reason for this increase is clear. It's rising production volumes. The single factor overwhelmingly drives the rise in emissions far more than any other variable. Despite sustainability commitments, brands continue to prioritize growth, driving up fiber demands and emissions at every stage of the supply chain, from raw material extraction to final manufacturing. Efficiency gains and decarbonization efforts are being undermined by the sheer scale of expansion. Without addressing overproduction, emission reductions will remain out of reach. Right now, production growth is far outpacing decarbonization, putting the industry's climate commitments in jeopardy. If this trajectory continues, we will not only miss our target of a 45% emission reduction within the next 5 years, we will also continue to actively worsen the climate impacts. The industry must confront this reality. Reducing emissions requires not just cleaner processes, but a fundamental shift away from unchecked production growth. All these numbers that we just presented do tell a story, but data alone won't drive transformation. We need a fundamental shift in power dynamics, greater accountability, and a commitment to implementing and scaling real solutions. We are at the halfway mark of the decade, and the latest industry we want metric provide a sobering reality check. We simply need to do better. We can see that our collective efforts have not yet reached the scale or urgency required. The commitments made for 2030 are fast approaching, and without urgent, coordinated action, we risk failing the workers, businesses, and communities that depend on this industry. Progress cannot remain incremental, it must be transformational. Today's discussion is about more than just insights. It's about the choices we make next. The tools, the knowledge, and the solutions exist. Now is the time to act decisively. With all that being said, I would now love to introduce today's speakers. We have Daniela Ceccon, and Director Data at WageIndicator. Lisa Süß could unfortunately not join us as she's not feeling too well, but she's here in spirit. Then Elisa Shepherd, Senior Advisor, Business Practices at ETI, and member of the MSI Working Group and Ordinary Responsible Purchasing Practices, as well as Sophia Ellis, who is the Senior Manager of Transparency and Accountability at Cascale. And lastly, but not least at all, Chandrima Chatterjee, who is the Secretary General of the Confederation of Indian Textile Industry, CITI. Before we go into the questions, I would like to highlight that we have chosen to take a different approach to this webinar this year, which has resulted in there being no one representing the worker voice directly on this panel, which is a voice that is much needed in these conversations and is far too often left out. And with that, let's go into the question round. Daniela, I would like to start with you. We've seen the trajectory of the metrics, and I would like to dive in a bit deeper on what that tells us, specifically on the wage data. So can you provide more insight into the apparent improvement in the wage gap metric, but also given that the data only offers a partial view on this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, actually, when I worked on this new version of new calculation of the gap, I was really happy and surprised to see the improvement. So I would like to spend a minute to say that, yes, there is an improvement. We see that something good is happening at minimum wage setting level. At WageIndicator, we also have a huge minimum wage database, the largest in the world. So we keep an eye on what is happening with minimum wages. And in January, there were so many updates and increases, which is, I think, what affected our presentation of the data the most. So yeah, and also it's good to notice that this is the first time after doing this analysis for a few years that we see a decrease in the wage metric. So I mean, that's really good. However, as you said, numbers don't tell us the full story. There are some things that are not captured and some things we need to keep in mind. So first, I would say the living wages. We have to remember that the living wage as a concept is a basic living wage. So it doesn't include fancy stuff. It doesn't include extra things. It's really like its components are really for a basic life. So that's something to keep in mind. So maybe in some places the gap is actually a bit more in real life than what we see in the data. Secondly, it's great that we went to a 41% gap, but 40% gap is still a lot. Because if you think about it, it means that a worker who is at the minimum wage level still needs to almost double. He needs to get almost half more than what he's getting now to reach the living wage. So yeah, there's a lot to do there. As you said, there are some countries that still have a huge gap, like India. So despite the general decrease of the gap, there are still countries that are like behind. And we also need to remember that in some cases, there may be no minimum wage compliance. So there are informal workers, contracted workers, of whom we know they're paid below the minimum wage and they don't come in the picture. Also, as you mentioned, there are countries where we see a minimum wage increase, also substantial, but it's not enough. It's the case of Pakistan, where the gap increased because the cost of living is basically outpacing the growth of the minimum wages. There are also other cases, not many, where there is no minimum wage or the minimum wage is outdated. For example, Ethiopia is also a garment producing country, but it has no minimum wage. As WageIndicator, we are running a project where we collect wages from the workers and compare them with the living wage. And we can tell you there's a massive gap. So, and that is not, again, coming in this picture that we showed you. Also, of course, there are many other aspects of the working conditions that are not captured here, but that are equally important to workers. So wages is only, I would say, part of the picture. So I think we can do more in terms of data as well, to capture the other issues that workers are facing.
Completely. Thank you to also pointing all of that out. And yeah, so now Elisa, sorry, the purchasing practice metric has also increased and actually reached its highest level yet. Can you provide some more context on the key factors driving this increase and also share the data, what the data might not be capturing in this case?
I mean, the data is providing a temperature check within the industry. We can assume that some companies are making more significant improvements whilst others are not. And we also know that whilst the survey was open to the whole industry, it was broadcast by ETI and Fairware members. So we know that there are more responses in there about ETI and Fairware members. And we know that these are bringing in better scores than the industry average. So overall, we can see that, yes, there's progress, but it is pretty slow for the industry. It's important to recognize that standard practice within the industry, so by which I mean industry norms, tend to be problematic. There's a lot of risk shifting onto suppliers. There's pressure on pricing and lead times. This impacts the supplier's ability to provide decent working conditions and to cascade good practice through the supply chain, which is why purchasing practices get so much attention when we're talking about human rights. So whilst companies are making concerted efforts to improve, and we are definitely seeing that they are making efforts, it takes work to get that level of systemic change and then ultimately for that to be felt by suppliers and then workers. We tend to see buyers as being in charge of purchasing practices because they hold the commercial relationships with suppliers, but actually there's a whole range of functions that influence purchasing practices. You've got legal teams that are in charge of setting contract terms. You've got finance teams that have a lot to say when it comes to payment terms and payment mechanisms. Buyers tend to be in charge of negotiating prices, but actually their targets on margin and open to buy budgets are set by a wider sourcing strategy. So we need to see coordinated company-wide efforts when it comes to responsible business. And the objectives set on responsible purchasing practices need to be reflected in the objectives within every department and not just within responsible sourcing. That takes a lot of buy-in and commitment at C-suite level and beyond. Our key resource, the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices, has a whole principle on this point around internal alignment. We also facilitated the learning and implementation community, and we spent more than a year supporting brands specifically on this point around sort of internal alignment and buy-in, because it was such a key enabler or a key roadblock to actually addressing practice. The reality also is that things have been tough. Everyone is operating in a difficult, unpredictable commercial environment. We've seen many manufacturing countries that have faced inflation spikes, cost of living crises, as we've just heard, political unrest. So whilst many brands and retailers have upped their game when it comes to responsible purchasing practices, the complexity has also been greater, and the need for this partnership approach has also been greater. On the flip side, we're also hearing from buyers and responsible sourcing teams that at a management and leadership level, some of the response to difficult trade has been to prioritize short-term financial targets over the long-term sustainability goals. And that's a mindset that we really need to change. A responsible approach to business and a partnership approach within the supply chain is essential as we face into increasing instability from the climate crisis, from geopolitics, from volatile markets. So we need to start seeing responsible business as a prerequisite to face into these upcoming challenges, and not just as a nice to have when things are going smoothly. Finally, I would add something to be aware of as we look at this industry data is that during challenging times, and we're certainly hearing this right now, suppliers feel even less inclined or able to speak up about unfair practice. So the responsibility becomes even more prominent for purchasing companies to seek to understand their impact and take action to improve.
Thanks for that insight. It really goes to show how, even though we can see that there's an improvement in the data and in the metrics, that on both wages and purchasing practices is still so complex, and we still have such a long way to go. And now to the metric that has actually gone in the wrong direction, Sophia. So essentially a similar question to you. But just with the notable difference, as I just mentioned, that the greenhouse gas metric has increased by a full 7%. What's sort of your insight on what the key drivers have been, and yeah, what the data is not telling us straight away?
Thanks, Hanna. It's also hard to follow up on the sobering and impactful headlines that you shared already, but I'll make an attempt. The overarching reason is really that production volumes have increased. These increases have simply just outweighed the efforts to decarbonize the intensity of that production, and this has ultimately led to a growth in emissions for the year represented today. The growth is being largely driven by conventional areas of production, and that's namely the creation of fossil fuel-based polyester products. I just want to pause here for clarity. That is opposed to the use of just simply more polyester fiber. It's really products that we're speaking about. So for those looking forward to a deep dive to really get into the background of that number, we will have to wait for the Apparel Impact Institute to release the latest update of the roadmap report, which is anticipated to come a little bit later in Q2. And the report will explain in a bit more detail what's behind the increase of the number, the emissions number, and the methodology. But it may appear now that the efforts are maybe a little bit more visible in RPP and wages, but less so in GHG. And of course, we just want to acknowledge that work is happening to transition the fashion sector, and to see it eclipsed in this way is tough, of course. No doubt for the individuals, the teams who are really working hard to change the tide. But we simply cannot let that number have a demotivating effect when action is needed now more than ever. As you've already said, with 5 years left against our goals of 45% reduction by 2030 in support of the Paris Agreement, industry is still in a position to make the systemic changes that are needed. We just simply have no time to waste. So to add a little bit of commentary, the GHG number, it really highlights this tension within the industry to make meaningful emissions reductions while addressing business models. So first and foremost, the imperative for the sector to reduce emissions to be in line with a 1.5 degree future, that continues. And it'll truly take an intersectional response from industry. We know what we need to see. And that's coal phased out, that's an increased uptake of renewable energy sources and efficiency measures, driving reductions in tier 1 to 3. And it's also support for implementation of low carbon practices at tier 4. We need to see also investment in scaling of alternative materials and innovations, and greater access to adequate financing mechanisms throughout the supply chain. None of that is easy. And it really requires significant resources and investments from all stakeholders. To build on the point raised by Elisa, the conditions for all of this to take place is based on positive relationships in your supply chain, proactively seeking to understand your suppliers, And that's something in Cascale we hope to support more and more, also with our recently launched Industry Decarbonisation Roadmap, which is sometimes referred to as IDR. And these conditions, they should in theory be increasingly enabled also by the principles of transparency and due diligence, which are being adopted by policymakers. So there are reasons to think we are moving in the right direction, but aside from the number, of course. But in addition to those continued efforts in decarbonisation, just to switch gears a bit, measures are needed to shift to more sustainable business models, models that breed respect for the garments, for the people who make them. And again, to reinforce Elisa's point, leadership, accountability, and integration of more than the sustainability teams against these targets is very important. We want to see certain actors, certain industry actors move away from a focus on volumes to one of value. Now, that is much easier said than done, and we know that both industry policymakers, they're presently grappling with those issues of operationalizing circularity, durability, resale, repair. The list goes on, and that's all before you integrate, consumer information, all at scale. So these are very big undertakings, but we have to keep moving forwards and not backwards.
Completely, and thank you for that. And now we've heard even more, and perhaps maybe not the most encouraging sort of realities of what the industry is facing. But also in that lies a lot of hope, because we know that the solutions are out there. We know that we can work against it, and we not only can, but we must. So with that, I would like to turn to maybe a more hopeful side of this panel. And I would like to pose the question of, what do we need to do to leverage essentially to come as close as possible to the industry that we want to see? On purchasing practices, Elisa, let's start with you. Essentially, how can we leverage purchasing practice? You already started touching on it, but I want to get a bit deeper on this one, to see, how can we get as close to the industry we want to see? What existing tools are there? How can people start engaging with them?
We actually need a whole ecosystem of mechanisms. We talk about responsible purchasing practices because they're a really important part of the picture. They're an important piece of the puzzle, but they need to exist within a wider enabling environment for human rights. We need systems that enable workers to advocate for themselves through trade unions. So we need collective bargaining agreements. There needs to be effective grievance mechanisms and access to remedy, and that needs to happen at both supplier level and at worker level so that there is recourse for when agreements are broken. I spoke earlier to the point about the need for C-suite level buy-in and beyond, and actually clear legislation would really help to make that happen. The fashion industry is so fiercely competitive that it needs the level playing field that legislation could provide. ETI have been working as part of the Working Group on Responsible Purchasing Practices. Together, we created the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices. We facilitated the learning and implementation community, and now currently we're developing the Purchasing Practices Human Rights Due Diligence Framework. And this framework is a recommendation to accountability bodies on the key actions that companies should be held accountable for when it comes to responsible purchasing. The idea is that whilst we need a whole host of accountability mechanisms and ways to enforce them, these mechanisms would be far more powerful if there were cohesiveness between them. So I use the term ecosystem quite deliberately. What we need is a better shared understanding of what should be reasonably expected from purchasing companies, and then these expectations can be built into accountability mechanisms. They can be communicated to suppliers and workers to empower them with raising grievances. We need a shared understanding of how companies can demonstrate this due diligence so that we can have comparable data that in turn could strengthen incentive mechanisms and that could support transparency. So there's a whole harmonization of tools that can happen to both support the full due diligence cycle, but also to support the accountability mechanisms. The purchasing practices human rights due diligence framework is based on human rights due diligence. It's structured around the OECD due diligence steps. And what it does is it sets out the key steps that companies should take to make sure that their purchasing practices are more responsible through a human rights due diligence approach. And then it details what is required to make sure that that approach is meaningful at each step. So that includes things like stakeholder engagement. And then we know from the practical work that we've been doing that there's key areas of risk when it comes to purchasing practices. So the framework dives into these in greater detail. We look at production planning that includes things like responsible exit. We look at payment and contract terms. We look at costing and how that influences wages. The framework is still the draft. The working group is going to host further dialogue with stakeholders to refine requirements around these areas to try and reach that sort of industry consensus and enable the harmonization on some of these points. And then after this initial draft and this initial iteration, we'll create some follow-up documents where we'll look at meaningful KPIs and potential ways for companies to evidence that due diligence. And then also we'll be releasing some guidance to support companies to achieve the requirements, but also to support accountability bodies in how to use the framework. Again, one piece of a much bigger puzzle, but I think having this shared expectation on what can be reasonably expected of purchasing companies is an important piece to then kind of help with that harmonization efforts to then lead on to better transparency, better accountability.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, yeah, it really sounds like the silver bullet that we're all hoping for is not there, and we really have to engage everyone at every point. Which I imagine will actually be similar for the wages metric as well. So Daniela, what are in this area some like practical solutions that we can use and implement now, especially, for example, let's say we have a brand manufacturer or any other party here listening today. What are sort of like recommendations that you would want to give them now?
Yeah, so talking about wages, I would definitely focus on the living wages as a concept, because well, now big brands are discussing living wages, they're using them, so they know how they are created and how they can be used. But what is important is that living wages as a concept become widely known and understood. We are trying to contribute as an organization by, well, apart from calculating them, but we also published them last year to make them available to workers, small employers, I mean, those who are not normally involved in the living wages discussions and often don't know what the living wage is and how it can be used. So what would be important is that workers and unions can actively be involved in the use of living wages in their negotiations for collective agreements, but even also to put for minimum wages increases at country level or maybe also at sectoral level. So this is a task, again, it's something that has to be taken up together. So not only us organizations who work in the field, but also, again, brands, companies, unions, and governments as well. Another aspect I think that is important is wage transparency, which should be definitely implemented because, well, being a data person, I can tell you that without information and data, you don't really know what is happening. You can't assess factories. And it's not about wage levels only, but also how wages are set, how pay scales are set in companies. Then I mentioned it before, there's the issue of informal and subcontracted labor. So these workers are completely out of the radar. So that has to be addressed in the supply chain. And then reducing the gender pay gap is in a separate kind of projects that can be taken up, because we see that in Ethiopia, but also in Indonesia, in Turkey, well, basically everywhere in the world, that the wage gap exists, and it doesn't exist only in general within the sector, but even when you look at the same occupations. So that's what our research is showing in Ethiopia, for example. And if this is tackled, this can help closing the gap also for men, because if women wages go up, in general, all wages go up. So that's an aspect that can help, and it's very, very practical. In general, well, that was said before, supply chain accountability, not only on wages, but also on other aspects of the working conditions, are also a good way to make sure there's transparency. Well, this can be done by supporting supply chain auditing, but also the certification programs. They are already in place. Companies just need to join, basically. And I want to end on a positive note, because we're trying to be on a positive side, connecting to what Elisa said earlier. There are many, many companies that are working on this. So as WageIndicator, we are a living wages provider. So we work with companies, and we see that companies are spreading the concept of the living wages, even in their supply chain. So we are doing webinars with factories in the supply chain to explain about the living wages. And some companies are actually even closing the gap, even in their supply chain. So not only with their own employees. So I would say that perfection is not there yet, but action for sure is. So I really hope that next year we can see again, a reduction of the gap. And I agree, Hanna, that somehow we need to continue checking this data and seeing how things are going.
Completely, I agree. And yeah, all fingers are crossed, I think, across the board to see improvement year on year. But yeah, to the one that didn't improve, I'm sorry to point that out consistently, Sophia. So again, reducing emissions is by no means a small task, neither purchasing practice or wages. But what would you say are some like tangible solutions that could help us get back on track and actually get to that 1.5 target that we're all trying to hold on to?
Yeah, thanks, Hanna. It is a really big question, what can we leverage to get us to this industry that we want? And for me, it was helpful to at least draw this kind of parallel to the vision of the work that we're doing at Cascale, which is to have a consumer goods industry that gives back more than it takes to planet and people. And in order to make these aspirational industries more industry realities, like we really feel that there are 4 problems that we at least are well positioned to solve. So that's like how I will structure the response. But first, it's really being that, as this GHG number shows us, unavoidable. We just need to continue to accelerate industry-wide decarbonization in order to make meaningful and measurable progress against the aforementioned goal of 45% reductions. Cascale is really calling the industry to engage with their supply chain. That would be the first point within decarbonization. Engage with your supply chain and not just tier 1. So supply chain engagement is a non-negotiable step of a just transition. And we see a lot of organizations stuck at those higher levels and missing the majority of the impact, actually. So 55% of emissions are in tier 2. And tier 3 emissions, which are largely hidden right now, those are more than double tier 1 emissions. So if you're in a familiar position with your tier 1, but less so with the further tiers, then engagement and really possible scaling of measurement and traceability solutions should be strongly considered. Just to reinforce, like Daniela's point, if you don't have the data, you don't see what's going on there, and then you won't even see the further discrete things that are happening beyond that. So really taking the time to understand the different contexts and constraints among supply partners in relation to decarbonizing, that can also help relationships. So engagement is really that initial step we want to see. That's prior to setting targets. We believe in the power of measurement, and therefore we just continue to recruit stakeholders to the intentional journey of education and emissions reduction that is associated with target setting. And that's why we have dedicated programs to support that. And finally, engaging with education, democratizing relevant education within the supply chain to those who need it. We believe that can enhance the industry's capacity to reduce emissions. So it's worth mentioning, like, Cascale is putting all of these actions into play through our various initiatives. And one way that we're really getting after that 45% reduction goal is through IDR, what I mentioned prior, the Industry Decarbonisation Roadmap. That is work that we do alongside the Apparel Impact Institute. And the IDR, it identifies and maps the areas where there is the highest carbon emitters. And according to our research, that really just spans 9 countries and encompasses 1,800 facilities, which are responsible ultimately for 80% of the emissions impact. The good news is that by identifying these hotspots, we can really help to focus efforts in this field. The second, kind of going back to the problems, the second problem that we want to see action against is around addressing foundational environmental performance. So the Higg Facility Environmental Module, or the Higg FEM, this is the most comprehensive assessment for environmental performance in the consumer goods industry. And the data from that tool suggests that while the conversations around impacts may evolve, there are still commonalities in what different supply chains are struggling with. And what we want to see is an industry which performs against the most foundational of environmental expectations. Moving then on to the third problem, we want to see meaningful progress in the adoption of responsible purchasing practices. These remain unfair, they remain a strain to business relationships, and we want to see improvements in the labour conditions for the workers in our sector. Cascale announced some major news this month, and that is the purchase of key assets from the Better Buying Institute. And this represents really a unique opportunity to serve our broad membership and other industry stakeholders with access to proven tools like the Better Buying Purchasing Practices Index, like the Better Buying Partnership Index. And these can really support streamlining those supplier relationships, improving payment and order practices, and most importantly, relevant for this conversation, fostering more accountability in this space. And the final part that I would like to respond to your question, Hanna, is it hasn't really been part of our discussion today, but we consider more action towards audit convergence as essential. So through alignment between social audit frameworks, such as the Higg Facility Social and Labour Module and the Converged Assessment Framework, which is developed by the Social and Labour Convergence Programme, members and other industry stakeholders, they must continue towards driving accountability in the sector in a way that doesn't paralyze the supply chain from taking other actions as well. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So a couple of common themes that I've sort of heard from all of our speakers predominantly are around just getting everyone involved and using the solutions that we have and we have seen work. And I think that is, in my opinion, at least, encouraging because they are there. We just need to get on to them now. And not just within the silos and like the ones that have already implemented it, but really, really get into the wider industry. But with that, and before I get to our final speaker that I've been dying to hear from, I would like to encourage everyone to use the Q&A box to also ask their questions. We will have a bit of time at the end, so go ahead and type them in and we'll get to them in a little bit. But Chandrima, thanks so much for joining us. I have a fairly short question for you, but is by no means a simple one, and might require some imagination with the state that we're in with the industry. But what does the industry you would like to see look like in 5 to 10, 20 years? What is your North Star for us?
Yeah, thanks, Hanna. I think I wear a little different hat as representing the entire textile value chain and heading the organization Confederation of Indian Textile Industry, which has members right from the cotton till the retail sector. It's a really big industry we are talking about. If you're talking of just the direct stakeholders, we are talking of at least 15 to 20,000 textile and garment units who can be impacted with what we have been discussing. We are talking of 45 million workforce that's there in India, and largely MSME units and a lot of women workers. So the industry I want, of course, is where everybody grows together, and that can mean huge multiplier effect, not for just for them, but the large number of dependent units and dependent families that are associated with that. So of course, the dream is about an industry where there is parity, be it access to decision making, responsibility, uh, of course, dignity, better employability, better growth, be it both the suppliers, the manufacturers' growth, and of course the related growth of the workers. So how does all that come is where a lot of this discussion was happening, and I completely agree with most of them. I just wanted to add the supplier perspective to this because India is one of the largest exporters of apparel and textile, but not just an exporter. We have a huge domestic market also, and they are not divided. So we are talking of a market which caters to the biggest population of the world as also a big exporter. So it's a huge ecosystem we are talking about. There, a lot of progress has happened because of the various, especially for the exporting units. I think it has been more than 2-3 decades of compliance first, and then what we are talking of due diligence and other requirements. A lot of awareness on what should be done and how it should be done has been there. We are talking of fair wages. India, if you know, as a country, is aspiring to move towards that. There has been substantial and regular increase in the minimum wages, but I saw your data and I saw there is India still figures in one of the countries with the big gap. There, of course, I was just trying to think what are the parameters to that, and there I think one important call would be to understand what is the nature of the industry there. Is it more at the low value segment, or it because purchasing practice, relationship with the buyers, the product pricing and all also have a huge implication on how that translates to the workforce also. So there maybe we are maybe you will see a little more not so progression where you're looking at commodity product markets like India and a few other of the similar countries. But and another important indicator is that what are we talking about? We are talking about a labor force which is in the organized sector. So for countries like us, where and many other countries where all these regulations, including the national laws, which is very good in India, we have, I think, one of the best laws when it comes to women's safety, protection of child labor, wage parity, a very regular discussion between the industry and the workforce on the wage. But all that is for an organized workforce, which is less than 10% of the total workforce. So I think there a very important determinant would be how many of them are entering into that organized segment to avail of all these instruments that we are talking about, all the regulations that are coming. Third is how much of it is a direct buying or direct sourcing. Because like in India, if I have been in this sector for more than 25 years, and I see a lot of these purchase of these buy requirements or statutory requirements are for the direct exporters or suppliers, which in the numbers, if I'm talking of let's talk of something like 20,000 export units, this would be just 10-15% of that. And the rest of the ecosystem is actually the second tier supplier or the outsourcers to that. And that there's a huge difference in how you look at these requirements as a direct supplier and as an indirect supplier. And there I think one tightrope we'll have to work is the more the requirements, the more the due diligences, that frontline suppliers remain less. The more there is, there is more transparency, access to direct market, more collaborative work, more shared responsibility and cost, that ecosystem can increase. So I thought I just highlight these, that while there is a certain ecosystem, as Elisa was using the word ecosystem, I really liked, because that's what it is. Are we also looking at whether that ecosystem where all these desired interventions are going, is it expanding also or not? Because that's how you can also expand the impact of so much of data, so much of work that's going. So both in terms of the direct manufacturers and suppliers, whose capacity building, awareness and monitoring is increasing, as also at the workforce level, who are the direct employees of these, that needs to also expand, because otherwise we are at the tip of the iceberg, and there's a huge value chain which still is not getting impacted at all, just because their access to this better ecosystem of the value chain is getting constrained by the increasing multiplicity, complexity of the requirements. So I thought I'll bring it there, but let me now come to the optimism and positivity there. Let's take the example of what's happening in India. Here, there are some wonderful examples of buyers who have a long-term relation, who have shown a long-term relationship with their suppliers. They have developed products together, markets together, and there's such a strong correlation of those units with the way they are working with their workers. There's a company, I won't name them, one of the biggest in India, where I think nearly 100% are permanent workers. They have a commitment of a lifetime of employment with them, and it's not a contractual employment. The company is growing, the workers are growing, and that's largely driven by long-term relationship with the brands and the buyers they are working with. Another good thing that's happening is that with increased requirements and digitization, uh, the skill set and the requirements of the workers are also increasing. So I think there's a business case that's developing of not having a very transactional relationship between the supplier and the workforce also, because there's a growing business case of nurturing talent, enhancing their skills. It is so directly linked to their productivity and the growth of the companies, that I think that's happening in a big way. That's also because the companies also, for the whole definition of competitiveness is undergoing a change today. Economies which are growing, like India, which is growing, and the per capita incomes are growing, the wages are growing. Of course, you cannot remain in the same product profile. Also, you need to improvise your product profile. You need to have better uh, value propositions to the market that you're catering to. All that also have a built-in business case for a better relationship with the workforce, better retention, and of course better nurturing of the workforce. So I think these are, and of course digitization and the social media and the good access to that, at least, is of course increasing the aspirations, and increasing the knowledge and the access to also better opportunities. So these are some of the developments, at least I see around me in India, and I'm sure that's happening in many of the other developing countries, supplying countries also, which kind of is giving a market mechanism for improvement of both the workers and the suppliers in the value chain, and giving a business case kind of a thrust towards the industry that we all are wanting to have, where there is better parity, there is better access to technology, knowledge, skill set, and capabilities, and market access. And of course that there's more trust, and there is more collaboration to work together and identify areas of complementarity, and a win-win for both to grow together. There's no other way. There's no other way but for all of us to grow together, because otherwise the kind of continuity needed, the kind of skills needed, kind of the market development that is needed has to be that if we are all together in it. So I see that's a good reason that we should believe that things will move in the right direction.
Yes, and completely, we're all in it. And I think at the end of the day, we need to recognize our shared responsibility for the shared industry that we have. It's not anyone's, it's all of ours. And we all bear this responsibility to bring it forward, not just for ourselves, but for everyone in it. And with that, thank you again, everybody who has spoken, and thank you for your time. Now, there's a couple of questions that I would like to get to, and I see some of you already typing away, but perhaps there's one for Daniela on, do you have tips for raising awareness among top management regarding a living wage payment? So sort of like around the stakeholder buy-in internally.
Yeah, so yeah, I wanted to pick that one up, thanks. And also the previous one, I don't know if it's from the same person, but which was about why the brands don't negotiate with trade unions wages for the workers in their supply chain, because they're kind of connected. So of course, supporting the unions is okay, as Elisa mentioned in her answer, but negotiating on behalf of the factory suggests a kind of top-down approach by brands to the factories. And this is, so we work with brands on the living wage implementation. And what we can tell you is that in general, the top-down approach makes the process really painful. So this is why, as I was saying, some of the brands we work with are taking a kind of longer but more successful route. So we run webinars together with them to explain what the living wage is, answer to the questions of the factories, and also the factory management. So the tip I would give is to involve the management, not only at the headquarters level, of course, but also of the factories in the supply chain in the process as much as possible. Listen to their questions, to their needs. We get so many questions from them, and even sometimes they question the living wages, like, but this is, I think this should be different. The number is not correct. How is it calculated? So we really work with them through implementation. And of course, this is not something that happens overnight. I mean, you need to take the process in steps in order to achieve, to close the gap for your company.
Thanks for that. And with that, I think that's all the time we have for the questions. But just real quick on the question on just a bit more insight on the greenhouse gas data, as Sophia mentioned, there will be the AII report coming out later in Q2. And the other question that wasn't really a question, but a recommendation for the industry, we want to start a podcast. Love that. Maybe we'll look into that. So stay tuned. We'll see. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, for taking time out of your day to listen to our wonderful speakers. And yeah, hopefully we can continue together to work on these shared solutions that we all need so desperately for our shared industry. So again, thank you very much.